My name is Claire Morgan, 34 years old, and last week my company hit a valuation of $95 million. Forbes ran the headline before sunrise, and my phone exploded with messages from investors, founders, even people I barely remembered from college. But the people who should have been the first to call my own family said nothing. No call, no text, not even a lazy congrats. It was the biggest moment of my life, and their silence felt louder than the news itself. Then, 12 hours later, my father finally sent a message not to acknowledge my success, but to summon me the way he always did when he needed something: family dinner at 7 p.m. Don't be late, dear. No context, no warmth, just an order. And the moment I read it, something inside me clicked. This wasn't about celebration. This wasn't about pride. This was about opportunity, the kind they only recognized when it benefited them. Still, I went. Not because I thought anything had changed, but because I had changed. I walked into that dinner knowing exactly who I was now and knowing they were about to learn something they never expected. Something I brought with me. If you've ever carried your family until your knees gave out only for them to ignore the moment you finally rose, stay with me. This story is yours. And if you want more true family drama like this, hit subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. On the way to Dallas, memories I thought I had buried began to resurface uninvited and sharp, beginning with the years when my sister Natalie Morgan was raised as the family's flawless creation, while I was the one told to keep my feet on the ground every time I dared to dream. Natalie was praised for everything: her school projects, her neatly organized binders, even the way she spoke at the dinner table, while I was quietly labeled the child who drifted too far into ideas and didn't understand how the real world worked. Whenever I talked about building something of my own, someone always found a way to remind me that Natalie was the sensible one, the reliable one, the daughter with a future worth investing in. I learned early that in our house, attention wasn't shared, it was awarded, and she won by default. The favoritism wasn't loud. It was subtle, woven into comments, expectations, and the soft, dismissive sighs each time I mentioned a new concept I was experimenting with. But the real cracks began forming when I started pursuing entrepreneurship seriously. I still remember the day I pitched my early product mock-up to a small investor group in Austin, only to receive an unexpectedly cold rejection. Months later, someone who worked with them told me they had withdrawn because Natalie had reached out, first mentioning I was unstable with commitments and always jumping between ideas. Hearing that felt like taking a punch I never saw coming. But what wounded deeper was a moment in our kitchen a year earlier, when I shared a prototype idea with her while washing dishes, not knowing she would present nearly the same concept as her own during a community entrepreneurship event the following month. The applause she received echoed through my memory longer than I wanted to admit, not because I wanted the attention, but because it proved that in her mind my work was hers to use. Still, I kept going. Not because anyone pushed me forward, but because no one ever did. I learned to code at night after shifts, built early versions of my platform on a borrowed laptop, slept in my car more than once, and faced every setback alone. No one asked if I needed help, not even when I had to choose between gas money or groceries. And yet, while they dismissed my efforts as hobbies, they worshipped at the altar of Natalie's competence, certain she would outshine me forever. That's why when Forbes published my valuation, the shock that washed over them felt almost visible even through their silence. Their world had been built around the belief that Natalie was the pinnacle, and I was the footnote. My success didn't fit the family script, and they didn't know how to rewrite it. As the skyline came into view, one sentence from years ago pushed past the rest, clear as the day she said it. Natalie looking at me with a mix of pity and confidence so absolute she didn't even blink. "You'll never achieve anything big. The country club glowed tonight, but the air inside felt icy as I stepped through the private dining room doors and saw my family arranged around the table like a staged photograph, each of them wearing smiles a fraction too tight to be real. Richard Morgan stood first, overly enthusiastic, as if sheer volume could disguise tension, while Evelyn Morgan reached out with a soft pat on my arm and a drawn-out, "Are you doing okay?" that sounded less like concern and more like an accusation wrapped in politeness. Before I could even sit, Natalie launched into a monologue about a major real estate expansion. She was supposedly leading complete, with hand gestures and buzzwords. She clearly didn't understand, speaking with the confidence of someone who believed applause was guaranteed simply because she expected it. The moment I noticed Harlan Pierce seated beside her, tapping his pen against a leather portfolio, a slow click of understanding settled in my chest. He had no reason to be here unless money was the true agenda of the evening. As the waiter poured water, the small talk turned sharp without ever losing its smile. Evelyn asked how I was handling the sudden attention, her tone implying she doubted I could, and Richard leaned back like a seasoned interviewer asking how many employees I had now, whether investors were nervous about a young founder holding so much control, and what my long-term liquidity plan was. Every question landed with the same muted thud. None of this was genuine curiosity. It was reconnaissance. Natalie chimed in between bites of salad, dropping comments about how complicated commercial development had become lately, circling keywords like permits, contractors, and projected revenue, making sure I caught each one. Harlan added pointed remarks about interest rates, market tightening, and how certain projects were being unfairly squeezed by banks, his eyes landing on me just long enough to make the subtext impossible to miss. Evelyn sighed about how unpredictable the economy has become and how stressful it must be for entrepreneurs, even successful ones, while Richard nodded gravely, as if the world outside were collapsing instead of quietly thriving. The conversation wasn't random. It wasn't even subtle. Every sentence, every sideways glance, every exaggerated mention of financial pressure was part of a carefully rehearsed script designed to funnel the discussion toward one destination. Even the way Natalie lowered her voice to say she was managing things the best she could felt like a performance crafted to evoke sympathy she hadn't earned. As they kept talking over one another, layering concern with carefully placed hints of struggle, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another degree. I watched them through the steam rising from my untouched plate and finally saw the pattern forming beneath their words, the real reason for their sudden interest in my success. They weren't here to celebrate anything. They weren't even here to reconnect. They were setting the stage for an ask, one they planned to dress up as a family necessity. And as their voices blended into a single rehearsed melody, the truth solidified with a cold, steady certainty. This entire dinner was being steered toward a conversation about financial trouble, and I was the only one at the table who hadn't agreed to play along. When the main course was set down, the entire table seemed to shift, as if someone had quietly dimmed the warmth in the room, and Richard Morgan cleared his throat with the practiced gravity of a man preparing to deliver bad news dressed as strategy. He leaned forward, fingers steepled, and began speaking about the company being in a transitional phase, a phrase so polished it hid nothing, followed by mentions of rising costs, delayed renovations, and unexpected setbacks that had placed them in what he called a challenging season. Before I could respond, Harlan Pierce slid in smoothly, outlining how banks were tightening their lending standards and how one of their key development projects was at risk of stalling if they didn't secure alternative funding quickly, his tone careful but unmistakably urgent. Then Evelyn Morgan placed her hand over her heart and sighed as if the weight of the world rested on her chest, saying in a soft, trembled voice, "Families have to help each other in difficult times," followed by, "Nothing matters more than family," the exact cadence people use when they want to corner you with sentiment you never asked for. I had barely processed her words when Natalie jumped in, abandoning any pretense of build-up, her voice bright and rehearsed. We need $3 million to keep the project alive. She said it as casually as someone asking for a glass of water, then turned toward me with a syrupy smile that didn't reach her eyes. You're successful now. Couldn't you help your family? Just this once? She added, nudging the moment further with $3 million isn't much for someone like you anymore. The room went quiet enough for me to hear the clink of a fork a few tables away. I picked up my water glass, slowly giving myself time to absorb her audacity, before I asked evenly, how much is the project actually losing, and who signed off on the contracts? Natalie blinked, looked down, and rearranged her napkin as if the pattern required perfect symmetry before answering anything. When her silence stretched too long, Richard stepped in firmly, his voice lowering as if he were issuing instructions instead of speaking to his adult daughter. You have the means, Claire, and now is the time to repay the years this family invested in you. We gave you everything we could, he said, painting obligation as generosity. He spoke as though the roof over my childhood bedroom had been enough to justify a lifelong debt, as though the moments they dismissed me had somehow been stepping stones they laid. I felt every pair of eyes at the table on me, expectant, entitled, waiting for me to fold, the way I once did without thinking. But instead of answering, I studied each of them carefully. Natalie's nervous smile stretched too thin, Evelyn's trembling performance of maternal concern, Harlan's calculating neutrality, and Richard's resolute confidence that I would eventually submit. Their unity wasn't comforting. It was coordinated. They were cornering me with emotion pressure and the illusion of duty, expecting me to ignore the gaps in their story and simply hand over a fortune because they believed family was a shield they could hide behind whenever accountability became inconvenient. So I set my glass down, leaned back, and asked the question that wiped every expression clean. If everything is as stable as you're claiming, why did the bank refuse to release more funds? The silence that followed was instant, heavy, and absolute. I set my glass down with a quiet click, and the room froze so completely that even the waitstaff paused mid-step, giving me the space to breathe before I spoke. And when I finally did, my voice cut straight through the polished air. I asked for the financial documents, full statements, loan agreements, cost breakdowns, and Natalie's expression tightened instantly, irritation flashing across her face, as though the request itself was an insult. She muttered that I didn't need to audit them, which only made me tilt my head and remind her calmly about the last time she interfered with an investor meeting I had lined up years ago, the one she tried to dismiss as out of my league, until the investor later told me she'd bad-mouthed my projections behind my back. Natalie's mouth snapped shut, her fork dropping softly against her plate. I reached into my bag and pulled out a folder I had brought because something in my gut had told me this dinner had nothing to do with family, and the moment I placed it on the table, Richard Morgan's posture stiffened. I opened it slowly, revealing printed emails, public filings, and internal contractor reports I had obtained legally through open records channels. The figures were clear. The project had not failed because of market volatility. It had failed because someone had signed under unrealistic terms and approved cost overruns without securing proper lender authorization. And the signature on all of it didn't belong to Richard. It belonged to Natalie. She blinked rapidly, breathing shallowly, while Evelyn Morgan pressed her napkin to her lips like she might faint at any second. I kept my tone steady as I asked why my name had been used as a credit guarantor on a secondary loan without my consent. That question detonated the last bit of composure at the table. Richard slammed his palm down so loudly the couple at the next booth jumped. "We are not digging up old mistakes," he barked, his voice shaking with rage, though he avoided looking at the documents entirely. "You will transfer money to this family, $5 million, so we can put everything in order." $5 million. He said it like it was pocket change, like the escalation from $3 million required no explanation at all. Natalie stared at me with a look that blended entitlement and disbelief, as though she were waiting for me to remember some imaginary debt I owed her simply for existing beside her all those years. She leaned in, lowering her voice to a pleading whisper that didn't match her earlier bravado, telling me I should understand how much pressure they were under, and how heartless it would be to abandon them when they needed me most. Richard repeated his demand harsher this time, practically growling that it was my responsibility to give back, and that this was the moment to prove my loyalty. Instead of responding, I closed the folder, letting the weight of it rest between us like a barrier they couldn't cross. Then I looked directly at Richard, then at Natalie, and said the words that made the entire table stop breathing. $5 million. When you couldn't justify 3, I asked, my voice low but unwavering. What exactly is this family hiding from me? The silence that followed wasn't just tense, it was terrified. Right then the door opened and every person at the table turned as Julia Park stepped inside with measured calm, her leather portfolio tucked under one arm as though she had walked into countless rooms exactly like this one. The maitre d' followed anxiously behind her, apologizing under his breath, but Julia simply thanked him before approaching our table and addressing me with a composed nod that contrasted sharply with the panic that erupted across Richard Morgan's face. She introduced herself to the family with professional courtesy, then set the thick folder in front of me and announced that she had brought the finalized legal documents I requested. Richard sputtered, demanding to know what documents she was referring to, and Julia replied without hesitation that they concerned the outstanding debts attached to Morgan Estate Holdings debts that had recently been purchased in full by me. The words hit the table like a dropped plate. Evelyn Morgan clutched the edge of the tablecloth and Natalie went rigid, color draining from her cheeks. Julia continued, evenly explaining that the bank had sold the entire portfolio after months of missed payments, and that, because I had stepped in to acquire the notes, I now held controlling interest over the company's distressed assets. She flipped open her folder, revealing signed agreements, timestamps, and notarized confirmations. Then she added almost gently that there was additional documentation evidence showing that my name and personal financial information had been used as collateral on a secondary credit line without my consent. She laid out the form and there it was, my signature forged, but close enough to pass a casual inspection, sitting beside Natalie's actual signature on the guarantor page. Richard immediately pointed at Natalie, his voice cracking, as he insisted she had assured him everything was standard procedure. Natalie shook her head wildly, insisting she had no choice, that lenders needed a stronger guarantor, and that she thought using my name would only be temporary. Her attempt at justification unraveled the moment Julia presented verification logs, confirming the digital submission had come from Natalie's own IP address. The panic that overtook her was immediate and raw. She turned toward me, tears smudging her mascara, whispering that I was successful now, and that helping the family shouldn't be a burden, that she never meant harm. As she sobbed, Julia maintained a steady tone, clarifying that under financial law and the terms of the debt acquisition, I now possessed full executive authority over the entity's operations, assets, and outstanding obligations. In other words, the family no longer controlled the company they had built their entire identities around. Harlan Pierce tried to interject, claiming there must be some misunderstanding, but Julia responded that the documents had already been processed and recorded, with the county clerk making the transfer irreversible. Richard's face contorted with something between rage and desperation, and he demanded that I void the agreements, immediately insisting that family loyalty came before legal technicalities. When I didn't react, he shifted the blame entirely onto Natalie, calling her reckless and ungrateful. Natalie cried harder, reaching toward me and pleading that she had only done what she thought would save their legacy, that I shouldn't let the company fall apart when she had worked so hard to maintain the image of success. She begged me to remember that we were family, that I owed them compassion, that they had sacrificed so much for me. Phrases that rang hollow after years of dismissal, sabotage, and conditional affection. Julia closed her folder and slid a single-page document toward me, stating that this was the formal notice confirming my new position as controlling owner with all decision-making power, effective immediately. The room seemed to tilt as the reality hit them. Their authority was gone. Their influence was gone. Their image, built on decades of curated prestige, collapsed in an instant. And for the first time all evening, not a single one of them had anything left to say. The room seemed to lose its air, and for a moment no one moved until Richard Morgan realized what Julia Park's declaration truly meant. He was no longer in control. His jaw clenched, his shoulders squared, yet beneath the practiced authority he had worn his entire life there was unmistakable fear. Julia stated calmly that effective immediately he was required to vacate all executive duties pending formal restructuring, and Richard's face twisted as though the words themselves were an insult. Evelyn Morgan reached for me with trembling fingers, her voice softening into the familiar tone she used whenever she needed something. She insisted we could find a way to work together, that misunderstandings didn't have to destroy a family, and that none of this would have happened if I had simply trusted them sooner. I kept a polite distance, answering her without sharpness, but without warmth, telling her that professional transitions required clarity, not emotional entanglement. She flinched, understanding for the first time that I wasn't slipping back into old patterns. With the silent stretching, I took a breath and said I was prepared to offer a severance package, 3 months of support to help them stabilize while the new leadership team stepped in. It wasn't generosity. It was a final courtesy to ensure they didn't fall into immediate crisis. Richard looked at the offered papers as though they were poison. Natalie reacted faster, slamming her hand against the table, shouting that she didn't want my charity, that I was humiliating them, that I had no right to treat them like dependents when they had raised me. The bitterness in her voice dripped across the linen tablecloth, and people at nearby tables turned uncomfortably. Evelyn hissed her daughter's name, but Natalie didn't stop calling me ungrateful, dramatic, self-righteous, anything to claw back control she no longer had. Richard straightened, regaining a sliver of his old authority, and told me coldly that I should watch my tone, that I was still his daughter, and that disrespect wouldn't be tolerated in his presence. He spoke as if the ground hadn't shifted under him, as if fear might still make me fold. Evelyn added that no matter how much money I made or what Forbes printed, I would always be tied to the family that gave me everything. They believed the intimidation that worked when I was 8, 12, 17 would still work now. I rose from my chair, slowly letting the motion speak before my words did, and when I answered, my voice didn't shake. I don't belong here anymore. The sentence cut clean, and for the first time, none of them interrupted. Their world was collapsing around them, and they still expected me to hold it up. Instead, I reached for the final stack of documents Julia had placed inside her folder earlier, the leadership transfer agreements complete with signatures from the incoming management team. I flipped to the last page, uncapped the pen Julia handed me, and signed my name in front of all 3 of them. The sound of the pen scratching across paper was louder than Richard's earlier anger, louder than Natalie's sobs, louder than Evelyn's whispered pleas. It was final. It was undeniable. It was the moment every illusion they'd ever constructed crumbled. When I set the pen down, the table was silent, the kind of silence that comes only when reality finally hits with full force. They no longer had power. They no longer had control. And they could no longer pretend I was theirs to command. I stepped out of the country club, and the Dallas night wind swept across my face like a quiet release, peeling away the last remnants of tension that had clung to me throughout the evening. For the first time in years, maybe in my entire life, I felt the weight lift with every breath I took. Behind me, through the glass doors, the Morgan family sat in stunned silence, surrounded by the ruins of their own expectations. Within a month, the fallout hit them with full force. The bank repossessed the oversized house they had poured their image into, and they were forced to sell off furniture, artwork, even the grand piano Evelyn Morgan used to brag about to guests. They relocated to a modest rental on the outskirts of Fort Worth, far from the manicured luxury they had once used as a shield against anything real. The whispers around town shifted quickly. People who once praised their influence now exchanged looks of thinly veiled surprise whenever the family name came up. Natalie, who had built her entire identity on polished appearances and curated admiration, lost her executive title before she even realized how fragile her position had always been. No one wanted to hire someone associated with scandal and financial misconduct, and suddenly she found herself working a regular job with a regular schedule in a place where no one cared about her last name. The glamour was gone, replaced by the kind of exhaustion that comes from doing work she once dismissed as beneath her. It was the first honest thing she had experienced in a long time. Evelyn emailed me a few weeks after the dinner, an email long enough to scroll through for nearly a minute. She wrote about regret, misunderstanding intention, motherhood legacy. She rewrote history sentence by sentence, trying to frame everything as misplaced love rather than manipulation. She asked for a conversation, a chance to rebuild, a chance to start fresh. I didn't reply. Not out of anger, but because some doors should stay closed when walking back through them would only reopen wounds that were already healing. Richard didn't write at all. His silence wasn't surprising. For a man who had relied on authority, his entire life losing control wasn't just painful, it was humiliating. Meanwhile, my own life moved forward with an ease I hadn't anticipated. I returned to Austin, poured myself into the startup I had spent years nurturing, and watched it expand with a clarity I could never have found had I stayed tied to the expectations of my family. Investor interest surged after the Forbes feature, and new partnerships formed quickly. I no longer second-guessed myself in meetings or softened my voice to be more palatable. I had walked through fire with the people who should have loved me, and I had come out the other side without needing their approval. I learned that independence wasn't just a financial state, it was emotional, psychological, rooted in the ability to define myself without waiting for validation that would never come. I realized I was stronger without proximity to people who diminished me to elevate themselves. And in that space of separation, I finally understood the boundaries I should have set years earlier. Some families offer safety. Some offer love, and some offer lessons about what love should never look like. I learned that loyalty without respect is a cage that shared blood doesn't guarantee shared values, and that responsibility is not an obligation to sacrifice yourself for people who never protected you. Setting boundaries doesn't make you cruel. Walking away doesn't make you ungrateful. It makes you sane. It makes you whole. It makes you free. Months later, as I drove back to Austin after a long day of meetings, the sky stretched open in front of me, a soft wash of orange and violet fading into night. My hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, my shoulders relaxed, my breath steady. I felt no fear, no guilt, no lingering sense of duty pulling me backward. Only peace, only certainty, only the knowledge that I had reclaimed my life. And to everyone who has stayed with me through this story, thank you. Your presence means more than you know. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, feel free to subscribe. I'd love to have you with me on the next chapter. Then, with the road open and the city lights rising ahead of me, I pressed my foot on the gas and drove toward a future that finally belonged entirely to me.